Lena took my bakery while I was at my mother's bedside. She signed the papers, changed the locks, emptied the safe, and told my staff I'd quit. She called our suppliers and told them to reroute invoices to her new company. She did all of it with my name still on the letterhead. And she did it in the span of 2 days. It hurt because I had built that place with my hands and my last savings. It hurt because I trusted her more than almost anyone. It hurt because she knew where I kept the recipe book. I'm not a dramatic person. I run numbers in my head the way other people rehearse lines. The bakery on Elm had been my plan since I left the corporate office 2 years earlier. I saved $32,000 from commission checks. I refinanced my car to pull an extra $6,000. And my mother signed a small line of credit against her house to keep the lease afloat for the first 6 months. Lena was the friend who could talk to vendors without blinking. She had charm and the kind of calm that made anxious people relax. She became my manager because I was better with ovens than people. We'd met in art school, sat next to each other in a typography class, and something easy settled between us. Lena moved across the country with me when I rented the Elm storefront. She had a kid then, part-time, and she needed stable hours. I needed someone who could manage payroll, pick up flour at dawn, and talk to the landlord. She took the books. She took the accounts. I signed the wire authorization forms I trusted the way people do before they've been taught not to. So we opened in late March with handmade flyers and a sidewalk chalkboard that read, "Cinnamon buns when warm." For the first year, it was a blur of early mornings and late reconciliations. We did pop-ups and a farmer's market slot on Sundays. The business cleared about $8,000 to $10,000 a month in gross sales, enough to keep us running, but not enough to feel safe. My mother's line of credit sat at $28,000 with 3 months left before the bank wanted payments. Lena and I argued twice a month about flour costs and whether to add a savory croissant. Those arguments were normal. The imbalance started as convenience. I was the baker. She was the face. We drafted the LLC together, or so I thought. The papers were filled out during a coffee rush. She handled the filing because I was covering a double shift at the market. She promised to email me copies. A week later, she asked me to sign a banking resolution that would let her deposit checks when I was not present. I signed it. The resolution put her on the bank account as a co-signer. I didn't think about it again. When my mother's health deteriorated that winter, I spent more time in hospitals than in the bakery. Lena said she'd step up. She ran the shop, paid vendors, and texted me 3 times a day with updates. I was thankful. I was also exhausted and at the mercy of systems I trusted her to operate within. She had every vendor's number, my landlord on speed dial, and the passwords to our point-of-sale tablet. The bakery never closed for a day. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. The first escalation came soft. A supplier called me and asked why Lena had authorized a large order of specialty chocolate to be charged to our account without my sign-off. I called Lena from a hospital corridor and she laughed and said, "We needed the stock. It's fine." When I asked to see the invoice, she texted an image, cropped, grainy, missing the bottom part that showed the total. She promised the real copy the next day. I asked the landlord to hold off on maintenance. He said he hadn't heard from me in weeks and that Lena had paid an overdue utility charge and was taking care of things. That should have been relieving. It felt like a rearrangement. It escalated faster the next week. I tried to log into the business's email and the password had been changed. I could still access the accounting portal with the last 4 digits of my SSN. But the bank notified me that a wire had been set up to move funds to an account in Lena's name. I called the bank. They asked for documentation proving my role as a member. I sent the LLC filing from the Secretary of State. My name was on it. They said the signature on the wire authorization matched the one they had on file dated 2 days earlier. I had not signed anything 2 days earlier. I went to the shop that afternoon. The bell over the door still chimed the same way. The smell of yeast was a small, private criminality. It reminded me everything could be small and real and honest. Lena was behind the counter. She smiled like an actress who had been given a better line. "You okay?" she said, fairly neutral. "I'm fine," I answered, because the word devastated felt disproportionate. It was a long word for a small shop. She handed me a cup of coffee while a line formed. Her husband waved from the corner. "I took care of the wire," she said, as if the wire had been a necessary diet change rather than theft. "We had to move accounts to pay the staff. You've been gone." "I didn't authorize that," I said. "You signed my name." She leaned on the counter. "You trust me, remember? You said I could handle payroll." "You signed for payroll," I said, "but not for the account transfer." The first consequence was slow and bureaucratic. The bank refused to reverse the wire without a signed affidavit or an injunction. The supplier put the chocolate on hold until they were paid. My mother's care required a new medication, and the pharmacy asked for payment I couldn't pull because our business cash was mid-transfer. Lena insisted I wasn't helpful, that I needed rest. She positioned herself as the reasonable one and me as the fragile one. That was manipulation of a particular kind, the kind where the manipulator frames themselves as the only stable actor and uses that frame to justify actions. The second escalation altered access. At first, it was petty. Lena changed the Wi-Fi password and didn't tell me. Then she changed the locks. The locksmith, called by the landlord, handed me a copy of a lease amendment signed by Lena that released her into sole possession pending a business sale. The amendment used my name in my handwriting on a form I recognized. The signatures were convincing. The landlord said he'd only signed after speaking with his lawyer. "We needed continuity," he said. You had been absent." I sat on the curb outside with a sandwich I had forgotten about and a recipe card in my pocket that I always carried. My grandmother's lemon tart instructions, smudged and folded. I held the card because it was permission. I had proof that I knew what to do. It didn't matter. The locks felt like a sentence. I called Lena. She handed the phone back to me like a weapon. "I did what I had to," she said. "You're not the only one with obligations." By the end of that week, customers were calling my personal phone, asking whether the bakery was rebranding. Lena had posted a photo, new logo, new font, tagline, Elm Fresh, a new chapter. She wrote in the caption, "Excited for this next stage. Thankful for the community." The comment thread filled with hearts like an accusation. I hired an attorney. She was precise and a little weary from years of dealing with small business fights. Her first question was the sort I had tried to avoid. Where were the original LLC papers? She asked for bank statements for the person who had access to the online banking for vendor contracts. The second wave of escalation was more direct. Lena began calling staff into the back office during shifts and, against my explicit policies, started cutting hours, then offering the shifts to her relatives. She instructed the head baker to change recipes to hers. She excluded the pastry chef who had been there since opening because the chef had sided with me on a scheduling dispute. The staff started to look at me like I was a rumor, real, perhaps, but inconvenient. I reacted by trying to be methodical. I recorded calls, I compiled emails, I wrote down the sequence of signatures and dates. I asked for bank statements and the bank requested a police report. The police said this was a civil matter. The landlord's lawyer said Lena had presented a signed transfer and held a signed meeting minute. The meeting minute read like minutes that had been made up after the fact. It referred to a vote. I had supposedly abstained. My signature apparently had been in the minutes in a style I recognized because it was my signature. I kept looking at my wrists, as if the thin vein there could prove I was the same person who had signed. The humiliation was public in a small way. Neighbors who used the seating area started to ask Lena questions in front of me. She spoke of growth and of handling it, making a virtue of the steady hand I had trusted. Friends texted me neutral encouragements. A few people didn't know how to speak to a disagreement where both sides had been people they liked. The bakery's Instagram followers split into private conversations I was not invited to see. I was also running out of money. The line of credit my mother had reluctantly opened was near depletion. My personal account was dipping into overdraft to pay for gas to visits and for mail forwarding. I had to explain to the clinic that I couldn't front the copay that day. Lena told them she would pick up the tab. She made a show of it, an exchange that read charity and looked bankrupting. It was performative pressure. She made me feel ashamed for doing the only thing I could not control, caregiving. And one particular escalation made the shop less of a place and more of an accusation. Lena called a staff meeting and announced to everyone that the business was pivoting and that their jobs were secure under new ownership. She framed it as an exciting opportunity. The pastry chef, Tom, looked at me privately and then left the room. He later told me he was scared for his family. He was 45 with a mortgage and 2 kids. He signed a new contract under Lena's name. People left because they had to. I could not blame them. I was asking them to stay for a story they were not part of. The legal side progressed in a fitful way. My attorney filed for an emergency injunction based on fraud. She called the bank and the Secretary of State and ordered copies of any documents that Lena had filed. Lena's lawyer countered with a flurry of motions. There were notices and deadlines and the kind of procedural language that makes everything feel like a far-off country. For every paper my lawyer produced, Lena's team produced what looked like equal and convincing paperwork. We went through an era of small betrayals from people I thought I knew. My mother's neighbor, an elderly woman who had been my first customer, called and asked why I had not come around. I had been at the hospital with my mom when Lena came by their house and explained the situation in a way that made my absence look like abandonment. Family members who had previously been supportive started to ask me whether I had signed anything silly. It felt like a social evaporation. The low point arrived in a morning that smelled like dish soap and old rain. I had stayed the night in a folding chair at the hospital and had a dreamless sleep between shifts. I went to the bakery to retrieve a box of recipe cards I had left in the safe. The landlord, with a tired face, handed me a final notice. The safe had been emptied. The recipe book was missing. The bakery's cash drawer had been reconciled into a new ledger with Lena's handwriting. The staff avoided eye contact. Lena's husband stood near the ovens, pretending to be busy. The last thing I had, my grandmother's recipe for lemon tart, the small physical thing that proved a lineage, was gone. I sat on the stoop until my legs ached. The stoop was not a place where you measured losses. It was a place where losses sat with you. I tried not to call my mother because I did not want her to hear that her daughter had been relieved of her livelihood. She was asleep when I called. Her breath had the steady, small rhythm of someone on morphine. I felt like an intruder in my life. I almost gave up. There are pragmatic moments in every story where surrender looks like a sensible option. I considered it. Opening a small, clandestine baking at home, offering deliveries, starting over in a town where no one knew Lena's smile. Then, something small happened that shifted the whole pattern. Tom, the pastry chef, texted me a single line. I recorded something. He attached an audio file. He said he had been collecting things that didn't seem right for a while and had used his phone once after a long night when Lena had a beer and talked too much. I listened to it sitting in my car, the engine idling, and heard Lena's voice, clear and unguarded, saying something like, "I had to take control. She was gone all the time. I signed her name. I can do it better. It's hers anyway." The recording was not a long confession, a few drunken sentences, but the admission was there, the intent confessed. It was the kind of thing a person says when they are not trying to be believable. That recording was a document. It was not notarized. It was not a mirror image. It was a piece of evidence that required context. But it was breath and truth in the same file. What followed was not sudden catharsis. It was paperwork and steam and the slow engineering of proof. My attorney used the audio to obtain an emergency hearing. She also subpoenaed our accountant's records, and the bank produced the wire trace showing the transfer to Lena's account and a later transfer from Lena's account to a personal account. The accountant, someone I had not realized I could trust so thoroughly, produced an email chain Lena had sent him that included draft minutes of a meeting scheduled on a date when I was in the hospital for a procedure. The draft minutes were dated and in Lena's hand. They admitted to restructuring. We put together a packet that was meticulous and factual. It included the original LLC filing, my diary entries of dates I had worked, and hospital documentation that placed me in the hospital, the audio recording, and bank traces. We filed for an emergency injunction to freeze Lena's control of the account and to restore the locks and the safe to my possession. The judge, a steady woman who asked precise questions, signed an order for temporary relief because the audio suggested intent, and the bank trace showed misappropriation. So the morning we went back to the bakery under the judge's order, the world was both smaller and sharper. The staff gathered in the back room in a way that made me realize how much of the last weeks had been a performance. People had eaten Lena's narrative and felt responsible for it. When we turned the key on the front door, it swung open like a promise. Lena was there. She looked smaller in the light that streams through the front windows in the morning. She had a towel over her shoulder, as if she had been tending to an oven. Her eyes moved quickly and then fixed. There was no grand confrontation. I handed the judge's order to her lawyer. My attorney read it slowly, the way someone reads a recipe they know by heart. Lena's mouth moved, her hands clenched. She said, "You can't just," and then stopped. The word trailed like smoke. Her reaction when the locks were changed back was the thing people think of when they imagine breaking. At first, she laughed, sharp and incredulous. Then the laugh turned into a kind of bargaining. She stepped forward and took my hand as if we were still in a friendship film. "We can do this together," she said. "We can fix the accounts. It's only paperwork." She tried to coax me with memory. She tried to frame it as a mistake, as an overreach that could be repaired. The staff watched. Tom had his hands beneath his apron. The landlord watched with an embarrassed face. Lena's husband looked away. When the judge's clerk explained the order, the word temporary was repeated as if it could soothe. Lena's face folded in ways I hadn't seen before. Shame, yes, but also pure calculation. She realized the audio mattered. She realized the bank trace mattered. She realized the way the world looks when the paperwork stack is on the other side. She reacted by trying to narrate events in a way that made her the hero. She said she had grown the business, that she had paid bills, that she had kept everyone employed while I was distracted. She used every small moral lever she could find. The staff's safety, the community's taste, the implied threat that without her the bakery might close. It was a version of the manipulation she had used from the beginning, calm competence as a cudgel. What changed was simple. The judge's order made Lena's narrative one side of a ledger. The documents placed a counterbalance. We negotiated in the clerk's office. There were no shouting matches. There were signatures and stipulations and an agreement that Lena would step back from day-to-day management during the litigation and that access to the bank would be restricted pending a final decision. She was allowed to retrieve personal items. She signed a paper that said she would not contact staff. Her reaction was a kind of collapse. She sat in a folding chair in the back and the edges of her face went slack. She looked at me as if she'd been caught naked in a snowstorm. She muttered something about survival. Then she stood and left without looking at anyone. The moment lacked drama, but contained a clarity I had not expected. It felt like a verdict in miniature. The consequences were complex and slow-moving. The temporary order gave me time to stabilize. I called my mother's clinic and explained the situation, and they allowed me a payment plan. The bank reversed the wire to the degree it could and froze Lena's personal account on suspicion of misappropriation pending investigation. The landlord undid the amendment. He had been embarrassed, and the reality of being on the wrong side of paperwork had consequences. Tom and some of the staff returned to their schedules. A few did not. People make choices when the ground shifts. I won't pretend I was absolved of all consequences. Lena's business contacts frayed. Some suppliers cut her off. People she had leaned on in the community, people who had trusted her smooth manner, felt betrayed in a new way and extracted themselves from her orbit. She filed a countersuit that claimed she had acted in the best interest of the company. Civil litigation is an exhausting thing. It bleeds money and time and creates a taste of permanent fatigue. The most important consequence for me was something quieter. I had to learn how to run the bakery without the illusion that one person could manage both the ovens and the ledger without risk. I updated signatory policies. I moved counts into joint custody. I asked my accountant to open a separate payroll account that required 2 signatures. I started printing daily sales sheets and sending them to a cloud folder. I automated tasks that had once felt personal. Those changes felt like small betrayals of trust, but they were also practical. People have asked whether I pressed criminal charges. The answer is that I considered it. The prosecutor looked at the audio, at the bank trace, and at the magnitude of the misappropriation. Criminal prosecutions are uncertain and drag people through public processes. We pursued civil remedies aggressively and left open the option for criminal action if the facts continued to show misuse. Lena faced the risk of civil judgment and reputational ruin, which in her line of work is close to economic death. That is not melodramatic, it is contractual. What surprised me most about the aftermath was the way anger softened into something like relief. I did not feel triumphant as much as I felt tired and grateful in equal measure. I had my ovens back. I had the recipe book returned with a small smear of flour on the corner. It had been shoved into a bag and left in a locker the staff used. Tom had found it and slid it under the counter during a quiet evening. He didn't announce it. He handed it to me as if the pastry was being passed across a table. I opened it and my grandmother's handwriting looked like a small, stubborn map. We repaired the business slowly. We lost some accounts and won others. We adjusted the menu to be tighter. We apologized to customers for shortages and told the story in the way you tell difficult things, briefly and honestly. Some people cheered, others drifted away. Lena's name for a long time appeared in text threads as a cautionary lesson. People stained her reputation with their anger, and in that there was now both truth and cruelty. Adds, I did not relish either. Lena reappeared months later, not to the bakery, but to the town. She worked in catering under an assumed name for a while. People recognized her, always with a cautious look. She did not approach me. I saw her once at a market stall 2 lanes over from ours. She was serving coffee. We made eye contact across jars of jam and nothing more passed between us. The loss of a person's place in a community is quieter than the loss of a shop. It is a soft, daily removal. There are things that cannot be replaced. The friendship I had was gone. We had shared art school confidences and the small rituals of someone who knows exactly how you cut dough. Those habits do not come back because trust does not reverse like a policy change. I still run into the kind of recognition that makes me wish for a soft middle ground where explanations would suffice, but I have learned that some things end because the person made a different choice than you did. What remains is the bakery and the small steady of people who stayed. It's the tart we make on Sundays that tastes closest to the recipe card. It's the ledger that closes at night with 2 signatures. It's the morning when the door opens and the bell rings and the light hits the flour in a way that is clean and ordinary. There are days when I wake and the fear returns quickly, small, precise like a splinter, but it dissolves into work. If there is one selfish thing I would tell you, it is this. You can spend a lot of energy trying to return everything to the way it was. That is a long mission with few guarantees. You can also make new policies, new boundaries, and a way forward that demands fewer metaphors and more safeguards. I chose to do both. I reclaimed what I could, and I made the parts I could control harder to touch. I do not talk to Lena. I have thought about sending a letter that says, in plain English, exactly what she took and why it mattered. I haven't done it. I imagine the letter like an old recipe, necessary, precise, and a little angry. For now, silence is the safest response. The bakery is small, honest in its hours, and messy in its finances. It is mine. It has debt and staff and a van with a dented bumper that leaks oil on rainy days. It is also the place where my mother counted out change and told me she was proud. She is gone now. She died a few months after the trial, which did not change the result, but altered the feeling of victory. I was glad she knew. That is not something I will dramatize. It is simply true. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. If anything in this story resonates with you, be it a theft of trust or a quiet recovery, leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had someone you trusted take something important from you. I read them.